Martin Luther King Jr. was a prominent leader in the American civil rights movement, best known for his leadership in the advancement of civil rights using nonviolent civil disobedience based on his Christian beliefs. He was a key figure in many significant events, including the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, where he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Martin Luther King Jr. received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 for his work in combating racial inequality through nonviolent resistance. His activism and speeches played a crucial role in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. King's legacy continues to inspire people worldwide, and he is remembered as a symbol of the ongoing struggle for civil rights and justice. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, into a middle-class African-American family. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a Baptist minister, and his mother, Alberta Williams King, was a former schoolteacher. Martin was the second child in the family and had an older sister, Christine, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel Williams King. Growing up in the segregated South, King experienced racial discrimination and segregation from an early age. Despite these challenges, his parents instilled in him a strong sense of self-worth and the importance of equality and justice. King attended segregated public schools in Atlanta. Despite the challenges posed by segregation, he excelled academically and demonstrated an early aptitude for learning. King entered Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta at the age of 13. During his high school years, he faced the harsh realities of racial segregation but also began to form a deeper understanding of the systemic injustice prevalent in society. Despite the constraints of segregation, King's education in Atlanta provided him with a strong academic foundation and a sense of purpose that would later guide his commitment to civil rights. After graduating from high school at the age of 15, King enrolled in Morehouse College, an all-male historically black college in Atlanta. This decision marked a pivotal moment in his life, as Morehouse played a crucial role in shaping his worldview and reinforcing his commitment to social justice. At Morehouse, King studied sociology and was exposed to various intellectual influences that would later inform his approach to civil rights activism. While at Morehouse, King was introduced to the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. This exposure had a profound impact on King, influencing his later commitment to using nonviolent civil disobedience as a strategy for achieving social change. After completing his undergraduate studies at Morehouse, King pursued a Bachelor of Divinity degree at Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. He continued to excel academically and was exposed to a diverse intellectual environment that further deepened his understanding of theology and philosophy. King's quest for knowledge and his commitment to justice led him to Boston University, where he pursued a PhD in systematic theology. His doctoral studies provided him with the intellectual tools to articulate the theological basis for the civil rights movement and strengthened his resolve to address racial injustice in America. Throughout his early education, Martin Luther King Jr. developed a strong sense of social responsibility and a commitment to challenging racial inequality. His educational journey laid the groundwork for his future leadership in the civil rights movement, where he would employ his intellectual prowess to advocate for justice, equality, and the realization of the American dream for all citizens, regardless of their race. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, King attended segregated public schools where African American students were often provided with inferior facilities, resources, and educational opportunities compared to their white counterparts. The separate but equal doctrine, which allowed for racial segregation as long as facilities were deemed equal, was the prevailing legal standard. The South, where King spent much of his early life, was subject to Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation in public facilities, transportation, and other aspects of daily life. These laws institutionalized discrimination, creating separate facilities for blacks and whites. King's early encounters with racial discrimination included the indignities of segregated public transportation. African Americans were required to sit in the back of buses, and they often had to give up their seats to white passengers. The economic opportunities for African Americans were severely restricted by discriminatory practices. This impacted King's family and many others, limiting job opportunities, wages, and access to various professions. Racial violence and intimidation were prevalent during King's youth. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups engaged in acts of terror, including lynchings and bombings, creating an atmosphere of fear and hostility for African American communities. African Americans, particularly in the southern states, faced significant obstacles when attempting to exercise their right to vote. This was due to literacy tests, poll taxes, and other discriminatory practices that disenfranchised many black citizens. These early experiences deeply affected King and fueled his commitment to challenging racial injustice. His upbringing in a religious and socially conscious family, combined with these first-hand experiences of discrimination, played a crucial role in shaping his moral and ethical foundation. King's response to these challenges was rooted in the principles of nonviolent resistance, justice, and equality, which became central tenets of the civil rights movement he would later lead. King was born into a family where the influence of the Baptist Church was pervasive. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a Baptist minister and a strong advocate for civil rights. The family attended Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where both King Sr. and Jr. would later serve as pastors. The African American Church, particularly in the Baptist tradition, played a central role in the lives of black communities during King's time. The church served not only as a place of worship but also as a community center, a source of social support, and a platform for discussing and addressing social issues. While still a doctoral student at Boston University, King accepted the call to serve as co-pastor with his father at Ebenezer Baptist Church. In 1954, at the age of 25, he completed his PhD and was officially ordained as a Baptist minister. King's training as a minister and theologian greatly influenced his powerful and eloquent speeches. His sermons often incorporated biblical teachings and Christian principles, emphasizing the moral imperative of justice, love, and equality. Throughout his life, King's religious education and Christian beliefs were inseparable from his commitment to social justice. He drew upon the teachings of Jesus Christ and the Bible to argue for the inherent dignity and equality of all people. King's leadership in the civil rights movement was deeply rooted in his faith, and he often framed the struggle for civil rights as a moral imperative grounded in Christian principles. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott met in the early 1950s. King began his doctoral studies in systematic theology at Boston University in 1951, and it was during this period that he encountered Coretta Scott. They were introduced by mutual friends in Boston's African American social and cultural circles. Coretta Scott, a talented singer and musician, was studying voice at the New England Conservatory of Music. Their connection deepened as they spent time together and discovered shared values, interests, and a commitment to social justice. Coretta was impressed by King's passion for civil rights and his dedication to nonviolent activism. They were married on June 18, 1953, in a ceremony held at the Scott family home in Marion, Alabama. Coretta Scott King played a crucial role in supporting her husband's activism and continued his work after his assassination in 1968. She became a prominent civil rights and human rights activist in her own right, working for racial and gender equality, as well as advocating for peace and economic justice. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a leader during the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 to 1956. Serving as the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, Missing in Action. The boycott aimed to end racial segregation on public buses in Montgomery, Alabama, after Rosa Parks' arrest for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. In 1957, King, along with other ministers and civil rights leaders, founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. He served as the first president of the organization, which aimed to coordinate and support nonviolent direct action for civil rights reform. King became involved in the Albany movement, a series of protests aimed at desegregating public facilities in Albany, Georgia. The Albany movement faced challenges, and its goals were not fully achieved, but the experience served as a learning opportunity for King and the civil rights movement. King and the SCLC strategically chose Birmingham, Alabama, as a focal point for desegregation efforts. The campaign included the Children's Crusade, involving the participation of young activists. Images of police violence against peaceful protesters drew national attention and support for the civil rights cause. King played a central role in organizing the March on Washington, where he delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech on August 28, 1963. The march attracted over 250,000 demonstrators and is remembered as a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. The march aimed to advocate for civil and economic rights for African Americans and was a key event in the push for civil rights legislation. King and the SCLC were involved in the St. Augustine movement, a campaign to end racial segregation in St. Augustine, Florida. The movement faced violence and opposition, but it ultimately contributed to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. King played a significant role in the Selma to Montgomery marches, advocating for the right to vote for African Americans. The first march, known as Bloody Sunday, featured violent clashes with law enforcement and garnered national sympathy and support. The efforts in Selma contributed to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. King extended his focus to address issues of racial segregation and economic inequality in the North, particularly in Chicago. The Chicago campaign aimed at improving housing conditions and educational opportunities. King expanded his activism beyond civil rights to address broader issues of social justice. He spoke out against the Vietnam War, linking the struggle for civil rights with the broader fight against economic injustice and militarism. These campaigns, along with King's leadership and advocacy, were instrumental in challenging and dismantling institutionalized racism and segregation in the United States. King's commitment to nonviolent resistance and his pursuit of justice and equality left a lasting impact on the civil rights movement and the broader struggle for human rights. Martin Luther King Jr. and his family faced numerous threats and dangers during the civil rights movement, as their activism challenged the deeply entrenched racial segregation and discrimination of the time. King and his family were subject to violent attacks and threats from white supremacists. Their home was bombed on multiple occasions, including the bombing of his family's residence in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1956. King and his family were routinely harassed and intimidated by white supremacist groups. This included threatening phone calls, hate mail, and acts of intimidation aimed at instilling fear. King was arrested multiple times during his activism. Legal challenges and arrests were used as tools to hinder the progress of the civil rights movement, and they often subjected King to physical and emotional strain. The FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, conducted extensive surveillance on King and his associates. This included wiretapping King's phone conversations and monitoring his activities, with the intent to discredit him. Vigilante violence was a constant threat to King and other civil rights activists. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan were responsible for numerous acts of violence, including lynchings and bombings. In the deeply segregated South, King and other activists faced strong resistance from local authorities and segregationist groups. This resistance often manifested in violent confrontations during protests and marches. King's advocacy for desegregation and civil rights drew the ire of segregationists who viewed him as a threat to the established order. This hostility often translated into personal threats against him and his family. King's support for economic justice and workers' rights, including his involvement in the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, led to economic boycotts and threats from those who opposed these efforts. The intense scrutiny from law enforcement and segregationists compromised King's personal privacy. His movements were closely monitored, and his private life was sometimes exploited to discredit him publicly. The threats against King extended to his family, causing them to live in constant fear for their safety. This fear was heightened by the numerous violent incidents that targeted civil rights leaders and their families. Despite these grave dangers, King remained committed to nonviolent resistance and continued his activism, demonstrating remarkable courage and resilience. The threats and dangers faced by King and his family highlight the immense personal sacrifices made by those involved in the civil rights movement in their pursuit of justice and equality. On April 3, 1968, King arrived in Memphis to support the strike of sanitation workers and spoke at the Mason Temple, where he delivered his famous "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech. On the evening of April 4, King was standing on the balcony outside room 306 of the Lorraine Motel when he was fatally shot. The shot was fired at 6:01 p.m. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital but was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. The news of his assassination sent shockwaves throughout the United States and the world. James Earl Ray was identified as the alleged assassin. He was captured at London's Heathrow Airport on June 8, 1968, attempting to leave the United Kingdom with a false Canadian passport. Ray pleaded guilty to the assassination but later recanted his guilty plea, claiming he was a pawn in a larger conspiracy. However, he was convicted of King's murder on March 10, 1969, and sentenced to 99 years in prison. Over the years, there have been conspiracy theories surrounding King's assassination, but there is no conclusive evidence supporting such claims. King's assassination had a profound impact on the civil rights movement and the nation. Riots erupted in many cities across the United States in the days following his death. His assassination marked a tragic moment in American history, and his untimely death left an indelible impact on the ongoing struggle for civil rights and social justice. Martin Luther King's legacy is profound and enduring, shaping not only the United States but also inspiring movements for justice and equality worldwide. His leadership and nonviolent activism contributed to the passage of landmark civil rights legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. King's commitment to nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience became a cornerstone of his philosophy and a powerful tool for achieving social change. His teachings on nonviolence continue to influence movements for justice and human rights globally. King's leadership was grounded in moral and ethical principles, emphasizing love, justice, and equality. His ability to articulate a vision of a more just and inclusive society inspired millions and earned him international recognition, including the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. As a Baptist minister, King integrated religious principles into his activism, drawing on Christian teachings to emphasize the moral imperative of justice and equality. The role of churches in the civil rights movement set a precedent for the intersection of faith and social justice activism. Towards the end of his life, King broadened his focus to economic justice, advocating for fair wages, better working conditions, and an end to poverty. The Poor People's Campaign, initiated by King in 1968, addressed issues of economic inequality and remains influential in contemporary discussions on poverty. King's philosophy and methods of nonviolent resistance have inspired movements for civil rights, human rights, and democracy worldwide. Leaders and activists in various countries have invoked King's legacy in their struggles for justice and freedom. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill designating the third Monday in January as Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a federal holiday honoring his contributions to civil rights. The day is celebrated with events, community service, and reflections on King's legacy. King's speeches, writings, and philosophy are widely studied in educational institutions worldwide, influencing generations of students. The Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site in Atlanta and the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change continue to serve as educational resources. King's vision of a beloved community, where people of all races and backgrounds live in harmony, serves as a symbol of hope and unity. King's legacy remains relevant and impactful, continuing to inspire individuals and movements committed to the pursuit of justice, equality, and human rights. His contributions to the advancement of civil rights and his commitment to nonviolent activism have left an indelible mark on the global struggle for a more just and compassionate world.